Good morning. Thank you everyone for calling in today for this talk, and thanks to the Crops TV team for putting together this great program. My name is Lori Nowatzki. I serve as the measurement coordinator for the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy with Iowa State Extension and Outreach. I'm based here on campus in Ames, and a lot of my work focuses on tracking conservation practices throughout Iowa for water quality improvement. I'm going to start with some background on the nutrient loss issues and water quality concerns in Iowa and throughout the region, and then I'll move on to talk about some conservation practices that are options for reducing nutrient loss and the adoption rates of those practices at this point. The nutrient loss in Iowa and in other states moves down through the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico and results in severe impacts on Gulf hypoxia, which is areas of depleted dissolved oxygen in the Gulf. And that has impacts on biodiversity and fisheries in the Gulf. And also we see water quality impacts here close to home in Iowa as well. This is driven by nitrogen and phosphorus loss moving through our surface waters. In around 2011, the EPA called on 12 states in the Mississippi River Basin to implement action plans for reducing nutrient loss in order to mitigate the effects on the Gulf of Mexico. In 2013, Iowa released its Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy. And the goal of this strategy is to implement conservation in agriculture and to install improved technologies in wastewater treatment facilities in order to reduce nitrogen and phosphorus loss by 45%. There are sort of two arms of the strategy. So one side is point source efforts. So these are wastewater treatment facilities in municipal areas and industrial facilities that release nitrogen and phosphorus to our surface waters. So point sources are working to install new technologies and facilities in order to address some of these concerns. And on the other side of things, we have non-point source. So that's primarily agricultural sources of nitrogen and phosphorus, as well as urban areas. Today, I'm going to focus primarily on the agricultural side of things, what's happening with nutrient loss in agriculture. But first, I want to give a kind of an overview of what kind of nitrogen and phosphorus loss we've seen during different time periods in Iowa. So we have a baseline of 1980 to 96 to look at what the annual nitrogen and phosphorus loads were during that time period in order to compare against for our goals of 45% reduction of these nutrients. Agriculture has been a primary driver of nitrogen and phosphorus loss in Iowa, accounting for about 90% of the nutrient losses during that time period, and currently, although it shifts from one time period to the next. So in 1980 to 96, Iowa was annually losing 292,000 tons of nitrogen to the Mississippi River and almost 24,000 tons of phosphorus. That changed a little bit by the time we hit the 2006 to 10 period. So we consider this sort of a benchmark period that occurred right before the nutrient reduction strategy came online. So at that time, so between those two periods, we saw about a 5% increase in nitrogen loss. And that's primarily driven by the increase in corn acres during that time. And between those two periods, we saw an 18% decrease in phosphorus loss, and that can be attributed to the rise of no-till as a prevalent practice throughout Iowa. So at this point, we're working to try to better understand what's happened since that 2006 to 10 benchmark period, what we're seeing in terms of conservation, implementation, and nitrogen and phosphorus loss in order to see what's happening currently and compare back to these earlier time periods. As a general outline of what I'll talk about today, first I'll describe a little bit very generally about how nutrient loss occurs in Iowa. Then I'll go on to talk about which practices are identified to reduce nutrient loss. I'll move on to discuss whether and to what extent these practices are being adopted. I'll talk a little bit about some early analysis we have on some economic considerations of these practices, and finally I'll discuss some remaining challenges that we see and areas for opportunity. Nutrient loss in Iowa is really driven by the prevalence of corn and soybean production in the state. As a result of this kind of two-crop system, we have, during periods of high precipitation, we have a lot of subsurface drainage throughout the state, whether that's through artificial tile drainage or through natural drainage. So that drainage carries, the subsurface flow carries dissolved nitrate to nearby water bodies, as well as to some extent, dissolved phosphorus. And we also have surface runoff and soil erosion, so soil-bound particles of phosphorus move off agricultural fields into water bodies, increasing the concentration of phosphorus. So this is important to understand that land use is a really a big consideration when it comes to understanding nutrient loss in Iowa, and for understanding what kinds of practices can be implemented in a conventional corn and soybean system in order to reduce nitrogen and phosphorus loss. So I'd like to talk a little bit about which practices we've identified that can reduce nutrient loss in a typical Iowa production system. We generally split up these practices into three categories. So the first category is in-field practices. So these are kind of annual management decisions conducted in the field, like fertilizer management, tillage, and cover crops. The second category is edge of field practices and erosion control. So these are practices that are placed at the edge of the field or structures within the field that keep nutrients from moving towards nearby water bodies or tile mains. The third category is agricultural land use change. So this is a more kind of extreme practice of taking land out of production, moving from annual row crops to other uses, like incorporating more small grains and legumes and grasses, or full retirement to perennial uses like pasture or prairie. Not all practices are created the same, so some are much more effective than others, and that should be taken into consideration when options are explored for implementing conservation on any given farm. So this chart provides kind of a look at the effectiveness of reducing the nitrogen load from a field. So what I'll point you to is the green bars first, which indicate land use practices. So land use change from annual row crop like corn soybean rotations or continuous corn towards extended rotations or pasture or other perennials tend to be really highly effective at reducing nitrogen load. So anywhere from 70 to 90% reduction. Generally speaking, the red bars, the edge of field and erosion control practices, tend to be moderately effective, and in-field annual practices tend to have kind of a low to moderate effectiveness at reducing nitrogen loss from the field. There's a somewhat similar pattern with phosphorus. So edge of field and erosion control and land use tend to have a moderate to high effectiveness with reducing phosphorus load, ranging anywhere from 50 to 90%. And then in-field annual management practices tend to have a low to moderate effectiveness, with the exception of no-till, which has about a 90% effectiveness at reducing phosphorus when compared to a conventional full tillage. So it's important to consider the differences between these practices, not only in terms of the feasibility of adopting these and implementing them on a farm, but also how these practices can work in tandem to work towards this 45% reduction goal that we have for the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy. Next, I'll talk about, to what extent are some of these practices being adopted? A lot of these are really pretty new findings. I'm hopeful that by the time this talk airs for Crops TV, I'm hopeful that an updated report on these practices for the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy will be published. If it's not at that time, it will certainly be very shortly after. And I encourage you to look at the resources document associated with this talk to look out for on different Iowa State Extension websites for updated reports on this. So first I'll talk about cover crops. Cover crops are a relatively new practice in terms of kind of their popularity. They've been pushed and received a lot of attention and education and resources and funding over the last 10 years or so. Back in 2010, there were really very few acres, very few farms implementing cover crops. And I'll quickly define cover crops. So these are non-cash crops, so tend to be grasses, rye, legumes that are planted following harvest or just before. They capture nutrients and keep soil in place during the winter and early spring before crops are then planted again the following year. So these are have about a 30% effectiveness in reducing nitrogen and phosphorus loss in Iowa. So they've really ramped up in recent years in terms of adoption. I'll point you first to the kind of the dark blue line at the bottom of the graph. This indicates the publicly funded cost-shared acres of cover crops in Iowa. So if you include both cost-share programs from state and federal sources, as well as a new crop insurance discount premium program through Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, all these public programs funded just over 500,000 acres of cover crops each year for the last few years. But we know that these publicly funded cover crop acres don't account for all the acres in the state. So we look to other data sources for that as well. So the USDA Census of Agriculture estimated that in 2016, or fall 2016, leading into the 2017 crop year, just about 1 million acres had been planted in Iowa. And if we look at a separate data source, the Survey of Agricultural Retailers, which is led by the Agribusiness Association of Iowa, they reached out to co-ops and retailers to gather a statistical sample of fields throughout the state to understand management practices. And they found that in 2016, just over 1.5 million acres had been planted, and that increased to an estimate of just over 2 million acres before the 2019 crop year. So we expect that at this point, depending on weather variability and other concerns, each year there's between 1 to 2 million acres of cover crops planted in Iowa each year. So that accounts for about 5% of our row crop acres. But the spatial distribution of these cover crop acres is not uniform across the state. So the map in the right corner there displays cover crop acres as a percent of row crop acres in the variety of watersheds throughout Iowa. So what we see is that along the Luss Hills, the southern portion of the state, and the eastern portions, we tend to see higher, 5 to 10% of the row crop acres having cover crops planted. And this was expected. This is based on the 2017 data for the USDA Census, and it was expected based on anecdotal evidence we had received prior to that. And we see that there's more challenges kind of in the Des Moines Loeb area, so central to north central Iowa. And that can be attributed to weather and climate, and also kind of the production systems, and also fewer opportunities for grazing cover crops. So it's, we continue to look at how this spatial variation is occurring and what we can learn about how cover crops are working in different parts of the state and how we can create more opportunity for producers moving forward. Next, I'll talk about tillage. So no-till, which is very minimal disturbance of the soil following the crop year or throughout the crop year. And then conservation tillage, which indicates about 30% of the residue from crops being left in the field after harvest. So these are two practices that reduce the amount of soil disturbance in a row crop field and reduce soil erosion and therefore reduce phosphorus loss. So as I stated when we were talking about statewide loads of nitrogen and phosphorus, no-till has really risen in prevalence throughout Iowa over the last few decades. So during that baseline 1980 to 96 period, there was on average every year about 2 million acres of no-till. As we move towards the 2006 to 10 period, on average annually there were about 6 million acres of no-till. And more recent estimates in 2017 to 2019 indicate closer to 8 million acres of no-till. So we continue to see additional no-till being implemented throughout the state. And it's the same for conservation tillage as well. So in that really early period in the 80s and 90s, it was about 5 million acres per year. And we compare that to more recent years, somewhere around 10 million acres per year. At the same time, we've seen conventional kind of full tillage decline in prevalence throughout the state. And this has really been a success story. It's really allowed for substantial reductions in phosphorus loss since that 1980 to 96 period. Spatially, we see kind of as we would expect. So the no-till is the left-hand map there. The no-till tends to be implemented on agricultural fields more so in kind of the hillier areas of the state. And conservation tillage tends to be used really throughout the state. So we're seeing more distribution across the state with conservation tillage. So again, this has really been very promising for conservation adoption in the state. Reducing soil erosion has been a really huge effort in Iowa for many decades, and we're really seeing the fruits of that labor, and we hope to also see that with nitrogen practices as we move forward. Another in-field management practice or set of practices that we're looking at closely is fertilizer application. So here I'll provide some information on application rates throughout the state since the 1980s period. So looking at the table, in 1980 to 96, corn soybean rotation acres on average were receiving about 150 pounds per acre, and that was the same in the 2006 to 10 period. And for continuous corn, it was around 200. That data was based on fertilizer sales data that's reported by the Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship. We have a new source of data that we're looking at. So this is the Survey of Agricultural Retailers, which also looked at cover crops that we looked at earlier. So that survey is finding that corn soybean rotations are receiving about 170, and newer data is suggesting for 2019 about 175 pounds per acre, whereas continuous corn has stayed relatively steady over the last few decades. That new data source does collect information in a different manner than the fertilizer sales data, but we are finding that this increase in fertilizer application rate on corn soybean operations is backed up by some preliminary analysis of that fertilizer sales data for more recent years. So we are finding through two separate data sources that fertilizer use has increased substantially since the 1980s. And that is a concern for nitrogen loss. And, there are, of course, many reasons why nitrogen application might increase, and certainly why fertilizer sales go up. So fertilizer sales have increased by 30 to 40% since the 1980s. And one explanation for that might be increase in corn acres, but the fertilizer sales increase has certainly outpaced the increase in row crop acres. These are statewide averages. So of course, different farms are going to be applying different rates. So the graphs on the left show for 2017 and 2018, kind of the bell curve, the distribution of different rates on the percent of acres throughout the state. So the red bars show the percent of acres that certain nitrogen application rates are applied to corn soybean rotation. So we tend to see in 2017, most fields were receiving 150 to 175 pounds. In 2018, it shifted up a little more. A higher percentage of acres were receiving in the 176 to 200 pound range. Continuous corn, we've seen the average stay the same. So most fields were in that 176 to 200 category for both 2017 and 2018. In 2018, we see that kind of distribute a little more along that bell curve. So while the average stayed the same, we do see kind of more variation across all these fields, across all these acres. So I've included a resource here. So this is the corn nitrogen rate calculator, which is operated by the Department of Agronomy and Iowa State Extension. And what it aims to do is to provide information on the economic optimum for nitrogen application. So I encourage you to check out that resource. It's really helpful for understanding how corn prices and fertilizer prices affect the optimum nitrogen rate. We encourage our audiences and agronomists and farmers to kind of understand how the economic considerations factor into application rate from a data perspective. So that resource is really helpful for starting to explore that question, especially as we're starting to see kind of an increase in the average nitrogen application rate throughout Iowa. Next, I'll move on to some edge of field practices, and these are practices that treat nitrogen at the edge of the field from tile drainage. So first, I'll talk about bioreactors and saturated buffers. These are two structural practices that pull tile drainage flow into them. So with bioreactors, the tile drainage is routed through an underground cell of wood chips that are buried just under the soil surface. And the wood chips treat the tile drainage for nitrates, removing nitrates before that drainage moves towards the neighboring stream or other water body. Saturated buffers are similar, though a little different. So they bring tile drainage in towards a stream buffer, and instead of allowing the tile to move straight through the buffer where it wouldn't receive any benefits of the buffer, it distributes the water laterally, kind of parallel to the stream, along the buffers with a perforated tile so that water can move through the buffer, through the root zone towards the stream, thereby treating nitrate, removing nitrate from that tile drainage. So these practices are relatively new, kind of in the last 10 years have started ramping up in use. What we see based on cost share data from both state and federal sources is that we think there are just over 40 bioreactors throughout the state and just over 20 saturated buffers on working lands. So we assume that generally these practices treat conservatively about 50 acres. Some treat more than that. So with that assumption, these practices cumulatively treat about 3,500 acres of tile-drained cropland before that tile drainage moves towards neighboring water bodies. The resources I've displayed here on this slide take you to fact sheets about this practice, and these practices are really starting to ramp up more so, especially given additional state funding for these types of structural practices coming online, over the last few years. So certainly an option for farms that have tile drainage moving towards a neighboring stream or water body, and perhaps even another tile main. Nitrate removal wetlands are considered another edge of field practice for reducing nitrate before it moves to surface waters. So the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program is a state and federal partnership for funding these admittedly kind of high economic investment practices. So what they do is they install a wetland at the base of a tile drained area that can be anywhere from 500 to upwards of 1,000 acres of cropland drainage that moves into a wetland where the ecology of the wetland treats that tile drainage for nitrate removal. So these are specifically designed to treat tile drainage and remove nitrates before that water moves along to another tile system or into a neighboring water body. There are just over 100 of these wetlands in Iowa at this point, and they cumulatively treat just over 120,000 acres of tile-drained cropland. And we continue to see these practices be implemented, and again, with additional funding resources coming along through the state, we expect to see more of these being constructed in the next few years. So these nitrate removal wetlands tend to be located in the Des Moines lobe and in the central part of the state. While we are seeing a lot of promising evidence of conservation practices being implemented at greater scales throughout the state, we also find it important to talk about kind of the scale of this implementation. So this graphic was created by Conservation Learning Group with Iowa State Extension. And it's not quite updated with some of these newer numbers I've shown you, but it does still help illustrate kind of the how much progress we're making compared to where we think we need to be. So as you see here, and as we've discussed, no-till has really had a lot of successes in Iowa over the last few decades. So if you update that number to about 8 million acres of no-till, we expect that in order to meet the 45% goal, we need to see no-till implemented on a few million more acres, depending on what other kind of conservation we're seeing throughout the state. Cover crops, we've seen gains over the last 5 to 10 years, seems to continue to increase in adoption. But we really need to see more like half of our row crop acres adopting cover crops, so 10 to 14 million acres. Whereas right now we're at about 5%. So we see about 1 million, maybe up to 2 million acres of cover crops implemented in Iowa. Wetlands and bioreactors and saturated buffers, we're kind of on the early stages of that. So we want to see thousands of these practices throughout Iowa in order to help address some of these nutrient concerns. And we're really scratching the surface at this point, but we hope that with new state programs, new funding sources, and also new efforts to kind of streamline the process for engineering and installing these practices, that we'll see acceleration of these practices in the coming years. Next, I'm going to discuss a little bit about some economic considerations of these practices. This is some preliminary data, some analysis that we're working on now using cost share data. So we receive program information from Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship that helps us understand not just how many practices are being implemented, but also what the costs were and some other data points as well. What this helps us do is to understand how expensive these practices are in terms of kind of annual cost, in terms of the number of acres treated, and kind of better understand how they compare so that farmers and landowners and agronomists can take that into consideration if they're thinking about a particular operation and whether a certain practice might fit into that. So we start with kind of a lifespan assumption. So with cover crops, that's an annual practice, so it needs to be conducted every year. Bioreactors and saturated buffers, they differ in their lifespan, but for bioreactors, we think 10 to 20 years before they need kind of maintenance. Saturated buffers, at least 30, maybe even longer, which I'm sure we'll find out more as we continue to study these saturated buffers that have been installed. But here I've made an assumption of a range of 15 to 30 years. Nitrate removal wetlands, we expect them to be functioning and in place for really a very long time. So I've used a range here of 50 to 100 years, but it could be even longer. So using data from the state cost share database, for these cost share practices, we see that cover crops have cost through these programs about $48 an acre. I will add a note that that's not expected to be the average cost for just any cover crop acre. These state programs have tended to fund seed mixes, which might cost a little more, or there are other considerations as to why they're factoring in additional cost. But the ag decision maker through Iowa State Extension estimates, I believe, that cover crops should cost around $25 to $35 an acre for new users. Bioreactors and saturated buffers, according to this database, they've cost about $200 an acre per acre treated by those. And then nitrate removal wetlands, they treat a lot of acres, but they are really high investment practices. So they cost about $570 per acre. I should note that currently, with the resources available through state and federal programs, these bioreactors, saturated buffers, and wetlands tend to be fully covered by public programs or by private partners. And typically farmers and landowners don't put too much into those edge of field practices, if any at all. Particularly for wetlands, they tend to be covered completely by state and federal sources, and in some cases by private organization partners. So if we take these, the cost of these practices per acre and take into account our assumption for how long these practices last without needing additional investment, we assume an annualized cost per acre. So it stays the same for cover crops, $48 an acre per year. Bioreactors and saturated buffers, we estimate about $4 to $13 per acre per year across the life of the practice. And then for these wetlands, $6 to $11 per acre per year for the life of the practice. So these just allow us to compare, even though some of these structural practices cost quite a lot initially, they do treat many acres for many years. And so ultimately per year tend to be pretty cost efficient. Cover crops appear to be expensive or costly in this scenario. One thing to add is that cover crops do provide in-field benefits, so protecting soil health and also helping with water retention and nutrient management and pest concerns. So even though they appear to be more costly per acre each year, they do also provide in-field agronomic benefits, which these other practices would not. So again, just another consideration for comparing these practices and taking into account a lot of different factors. Finally, I'll talk about what we see as some remaining challenges at this point and some areas for opportunity. We see the adoption of some of these practices increasing to some extent and to quite a lot in some cases, but we do want to remain cognizant of what that means for kind of the future of conservation and what challenges we're experiencing in some parts of the state. So I'll start with agricultural land use. So this is, as we discussed when we were talking about the process for nutrient loss in Iowa and how that occurs in the field, land use is a huge consideration when it comes to understanding nutrient loss. So since the early 1980s, we've seen increases in row crop production. Corn and soybeans have continued to dominate in the state. And we've seen a decline in some other agricultural uses. So certainly a decline in small grains or other field crops. And also, to some extent, we've seen declines in acres of pasture. So this is this increase in corn and soybeans is exacerbating nutrient loss. And if we continue to see patterns of land use changing to incorporate more of these annual row crops, then we'll start to see our efforts towards conservation being outweighed by the changes in land use that we could potentially see in future years. So here's an example of kind of the prevalence of corn, soybean, and continuous corn. This shouldn't be unfamiliar to anybody necessarily. So in some parts of the state, corn and soybeans really dominate, upwards of 70 to 90% of the agricultural land in those areas. And then, some parts of the state less so. So the southern portion and the northeast portion have more grazing, more dairies. And so we kind of see the inverse with on the right, the map with extended rotations and pasture and grasses, long-term hay, those kinds of operations tend to concentrate more in the northeast and southeast portions of the state and less so in the other portions of the state. So certainly there are reasons for that. In the western and central parts of Iowa, there's less opportunity for having livestock grazing, for having pasture. So, less of a market for small grains or other secondary crops. So certainly it's a challenge, and trying to understand land use change is a really complex issue. So landowner decisions are really complex and take into account economics and markets and even convenience for the farmer. So we do want to emphasize that these changes don't need to occur on a whole field scale. So there's kind of a renaissance of precision agriculture and precision conservation happening at this time. So an example of this, it comes from some modeling efforts conducted at Iowa State University. The first hyperlink I've provided there is where you can access some maps throughout the state of how they estimate land use and production affecting the profitability within a field at a subfield scale. So this is one field in central Iowa in 2 different years, a couple years apart. So in one year, the markets and the weather were really favorable for this field and allowed for high profitability mostly throughout the field. But then in another year, you see that profitability was lower, or it was even losing money in certain parts of the field due to market conditions or other factors. So we hope that we can continue to spread the word about the targeted in-field, subfield land use change, opportunities for retiring small parts of a field that are no longer profitable or even lose money, and instead of crop production in those small subfield areas, considering other options like prairie for habitat or other types of land retirement in those areas to increase the profitability across the whole field. So the second link I've provided here takes you to Iowa Pheasants Forever, which provides a lot of resources on precision conservation. We also want to share some resources on strategies for implementing new practices. So beyond land use change, what kind of considerations should be taken into account when implementing in-field practices or edge-of-field practices? So this resource was released by the Conservation Learning Group with Iowa State Extension in 2020. They work together with a broad array of agency partners and on-farm research organizations and commodity groups to achieve a consensus about recommendations for certain conservation practices, how those practices fit into current operations, and what benefits those practices might achieve. So they provide a really data-driven look at conservation implementation, and also some really helpful decision trees for new users for certain practices. Like a new user for cover crops can work through a decision tree to understand how cover crops might fit into their operation, what kind of decisions they might need to make, and what recommendations these organizations are putting out there for new users. So the link I provided here will take you to this document, and I encourage you to browse through it and consider these sets of recommendations for these practices. Finally, I want to share just a little more about the public programs and watershed level resources that are available. So this map, it may have changed a little bit since we've updated it, but generally it displays where watershed projects are located throughout Iowa. So these watershed projects might have a dedicated coordinator, additional cost share funding, and other resources available. So they're really locally driven, community driven, and they aim to provide a lot of extra support and resources for soil and water conservation to farmers and landowners in their area. So I encourage you to look at the Water Quality Program website for extension, or reach out to me directly if you're hoping to understand more about what kinds of programs are available in small watersheds or large watersheds near you or near your producers that you work with. With that, I want to thank you for tuning in today. My contact information is here, and I welcome you to reach out to me with questions or ask questions during the live session, and I'll be there to answer what I can or direct you in the right direction. Thank you.